My name is Andreas Widmer. I'm the director of the Sioka Center and was very blessed to be one of the co-workers here with Michael Novak when he was at CUA. As a matter of fact, we shared an office, and it was humbling to share an office with Michael Novak and to see the pace that he works at and the pace that I work at, and our age difference. It was an inverse relationship. What we want to do now is see this first time that we want to celebrate Michael's life and Michael's legacy is to focus on, in a sense, our friendship with him and our love for him and his love for us and what he taught us and how he mentored many of us and inspired many of us. And so this first time that we celebrate this, we want it to be somewhat personal. And that's why we didn't ask for large academic papers to do today, but to take a personal approach to Michael. And so we invited two kinds of panels here today. One panel of his colleagues and one panel of his students. And this here is the colleagues panel. And we invited three distinguished colleagues of his from different backgrounds and colleagues in different ways. We have here Professor Max Torres, who is a colleague here at CUA. He heads up the management area, which entrepreneurship is a part of. And he is also the recipient of the Novak Award in 2003 from the Acton Institute. We have Aurora Griffin, who is a professor in the philosophy school?
I work in the president's office.
In the president's office, and has known Michael Novak extensively and has worked with him. And we have Professor Pekalik here, who has been a colleague of his probably the longest out of all of us because he worked with him at Ave Maria University and then here at CUA. I thought it would be appropriate to start with you, Max, because you were actually honored in Michael's name with the Novak Award. And I don't know how well you knew him before that, but then you certainly became to know him much better after receiving the award and finally working with him. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with that?
I'd be happy to. Can everybody hear me? Closer? Is it off?
Yeah.
Where?
It's on.
Okay. How's this? Okay, that sounds better. You can hear? Okay, great. Prior to meeting Michael, I didn't know him at all, actually, except through a reading of The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism in my doctoral program. And I have to admit, when I won the Novak Award, I wasn't quite convinced. I had read the book. I had reservations on the basis of his wholehearted embrace, it seemed to me, of the liberal in the continental sense, the liberal order of natural liberty. I just wasn't so sure, that being a Catholic, and I spent the year prior to making my speech, because I was named in 2003 and then spoke in 2004. I spent that year resolving those doubts and resolving them in favor of Michael's work. And the reason I was able to do that is I recognize in his work, fundamentally, his anthropology was a Christian Catholic anthropology. The person at the center of his work was a person that was hardwired to seek truth, good, beauty, unity, and that needed freedom in order to do that. And that convinced me. So I was able to give the talk. I met him there. I met him that night at the dinner. What struck me about him the night I met him was he sat quietly and listened to us as if we had something to say. He partook. He just absorbed it all and took it all in. So of course I met him many times after that, and I was really thrilled to work with him last year. He spent the last year of his life on Earth here at Catholic U. So we all had a chance to really pick his brain and have a good time with him. But that's my memory of the Novak Award.
You gave a talk when you received the award?
I did, yeah.
Did he react to your talk?
He did, but his only reaction, he came up to me afterwards, he shook my hand, he said, good luck getting it published. That was it. You know,
Was that a compliment or a realism?
to this day, I don't know. It's all I quite.
He had that way about him. Aurora, tell us a little bit about how you met him and maybe some of the memorable moments you spent with him.
Absolutely. Okay, can you guys hear me? Yes, okay, perfect. I want to say I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy that we're having this event, and I'm honored to be included on the panel of his colleagues. It's just an incredible privilege. I think Michael would have loved that we got together and honored him with an academic conference. More than that, I look out at the audience and I see several people whom I know and have developed deep friendships with because of Michael. And I think he would have loved that too. So I think this is a very fitting way to honor him. I only actually knew him in the final years of his life. I met him in 2014, and it was kind of a funny story. I was at the Acton Institute. We were at a banquet one of the evenings, sitting across from each other, and he took an interest in me. I was nobody, young and just sitting there trying to bide my time. And he says, "Well, who are you and what are you doing?" And I said, I'm Aurora. I'm heading off to Oxford this next year." And he says, "Oh, Oxford. I know the most Catholic and conservative girl there." And I said, "Until I get there." And he just loved that. He told that story many, many times after the fact. And he brought it up to me a couple years later, in fact. And I said, "Look, I didn't take it personally." He says, he came up to me after the conference and said, that comment, "I am just so smitten with you. What can I do for you? I want to help you." And I said, "Okay, great." But I told him later, I didn't take that personally. And he got cross. He was very confused and flustered. And he said, "Of course I meant that personally. I just didn't mean it matrimonially." So Michael was such a dear friend and taught me so much. I'm just so grateful to be able to be here and talk more about his legacy, but I'll save the rest of my time for the next round.
It's interesting. I also I met Michael at a Templeton event, and I didn't know of him or didn't know him at all. And I think many of us can share in this experience that when I met him, we ended up sitting next to each other. It was one of the Templeton Prize Award events, and he sat next to me and started to say like, "Who are you?" And I'm like, "You want to hear about me? I can talk about me forever." And we parted ways. Me having his card, he was still at AEI. Me having his card, and I knew nothing about him, and he knew everything about me. And I think that's a great sign of how Michael acted in the world, that he was, and I think this is what you reflected in his way to be able to engage in argument with others, is that he actually understood you, and he was genuinely interested in getting to know other people. So it was my experience in meeting him. Michael, you know him the longest. Tell us a bit.
All right, so I have three things I wanted to draw attention to. The first is kind of a confession, actually. When I went down to Ave Maria and began to spend a lot of time with Novak, and I hadn't really before then, we'd corresponded and seen each other at conferences in Washington and so on. What I saw in him was, well, Newman speaks somewhere of where you enter a company and you discover that the people in that company are at a higher level than you are, and you notice that you're constantly misstepping and you're not really as refined and as well-mannered, so to speak, as that the people in that company. I discovered that with Novak. I'm a very combative and pugnacious person, some of you may know in this room, but so is Novak. So was Novak, so is Novak, I presume. And but he was always spoke and acted with utmost gentility and refinement. He was a real gentleman, and very polished, and always qualified when qualification was necessary. this impressed me very much. I said, I want to be like that. I want to be like Novak in this regard. And I hope I did learn something from him. He was a real gentleman. That's the first thing I wanted to say. Now, the second thing is 2 years ago, he and I, at almost exactly this time, were at the American Maritime Association conference in New York City. It was at Fordham. And we stayed down the hall from each other in a hotel, and we'd go to the meetings together. Went out to dinner a few times, too. And he read there an essay on Léon Blois, who was a great French Catholic existentialist, I think you might say, who was enormously influential for the Maritains. And this was before a learned audience, and it was very highly regarded. It was very beautifully put together and explained. I was searching through my email to try to find the text of this talk, which he sent me at around that time, because I wanted to quote from it, and I couldn't find it. I don't know, my email on my phone doesn't go back far enough. It doesn't go back 2 years, whatever. So I just searched on Blois and Novak, and well, there it is. It was published in Crisis, March, almost 2 years ago. And it's almost exactly the same talk, as far as I can remember, that he gave to the American Maritime Association, but it reads beautifully as an article in Crisis. So this is the second thing that I want to point out about him, his wonderful ability to bridge the scholarly and the popular. It's unrivaled, I think, in our time. It's just remarkable how he could speak to both audiences and with the same words. And then here's the third thing, and it really relates to Léon Blois. So I have this article here, and so many times Michael Novak is dealt with unjustly. He's a very deep and complex person. In his classes, almost no matter what the subject was, political philosophy, American, the Catholic intellectual renaissance of the 20th century, justice, he would typically begin with a discussion of existentialism and Camus. And he thought you had to have a dark night of the soul, really, or walk through one before you could come out on the other side and be a true, genuine Christian. He really, I want to say, hated forms of Pharisaical religion, false religion, cardboard religion. And he was drawn to the Maritains for this reason, who were drawn to Blois for this reason. So I want you to think of a kind of sequence here. You have Léon Blois, who energized the Maritains, who energized Novak, who then quotes from Maritain in his Crisis piece, and now it's like an electric current going through a wire. It's right now, it's here too as well. There's a kind of transmission of the spiritual energy which goes through Novak. Let me just quote some of his this passage about Blois, written by Maritain, Jacques Maritain. Blois was a sort of bedazzled prophet of extraordinary intuitive genius in a kind of wild primitive state possessed by the Holy Spirit. He was filled with supernatural gifts of extraordinary power joined to the sensitivity of a pure poet in which the ways and tools of reason played almost no role at all. I understand only what I divine, he liked to say, so that it was not very surprising to find in him sometimes, along with the prodigiously penetrating intuitions of a visionary which enabled him to touch the ineffable and to reveal the most profound truths, an enormous naivete as well concerning matters of secondary importance. Novak italicizes that and he says, emphasis added. We must note also, and he did so himself, that he experienced immense impulses of a love obsessed by the desire for God which overflowed its banks, and because of which, due to his affectionate, loving nature, his life was filled with lapses, with remorse, with confessions, and with relapses that left him tortured by moral anguish in the midst of material destitution. This is the spirit that Michael Novak wants to quote. So,
Beautiful. If we move a little bit along that line into the ideas that maybe he conveyed to you, or that you find are some of the most important legacies that he will leave to us, could you maybe think about, Max, starting with you, of some of the most important intellectual contributions that Michael made in your estimation?
In my estimation, so let's preface it there. Michael's largest contribution, and he made many, but to my mind, his largest was one to the Catholic world. You know, he was engaged in dialogue with the entire world, But there was something specific he told the Catholic world, which was that we could, in good conscience, embrace the liberal order of natural liberty, which included economic liberty, political liberty, and a moral ecology, which he saw as sort of cultural moral liberty in religion and conscience, in the arts and the sciences, in the cultural expression. And you'll see how much, you can sense how much overlap there is with the United States of America and its founding principles in that paradigm of a political order or of a political economy, which is really a cultural political economy. He was telling this to Catholics. More parochially, American Catholics could embrace their country's founding and love her founding principles, which some people have a doubt about. He thought that these principles were largely biblical, that they were Christian principles, and he avoided. I think his contribution is that he avoided the excess of rejecting the faith for not being sufficiently modern or sufficiently American, and he also avoided the defect of rejecting America and modernity for not being sufficiently Catholic or being sufficiently committed or based upon the good as opposed to liberty. Michael's work, he seemed, to my mind, he took the liberal route, liberal in the continental sense, again, not in the sense that we speak about it. He took it with the great faith that because the person was what the person was and the way the person was ordered, they would find the good. That what we were going to do is we were going to build institutions predicated on a system of natural liberty, and that we had done that. I think that was a very immensely important contribution, and I see him as a thinker of the order of John Courtney Murray, who did something similar with Dignitatis Humanae. How he informed the Declaration on Religious Liberty at the Second Vatican Council. Michael, I think his influence was on Centesimus Annus, on the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. He had that kind of impact in the Catholic world through a magisterial document. We know of his thinking that there are three interdependent, interactive systems of cultural democratic capitalism, all three things. He called it democratic capitalism. Why he left the term cultural out, I don't know, because that was that was the safeguard of the entire system. That somehow politics and economics were interdependent and bound, inextricably linked with a cultural moral order that had the necessarily helped human beings develop virtues, to develop the things that they were going to need to live in a free economic system. Each of those systems, fundamentally, I think, was informed by a spirit of service. So that the person engaged in economic activity was looking to serve the needs of somebody at the end of their product or service. That was the rightly ordered way to attend to economic activity. Political activity was ordered towards service through the common good, towards the whole good of all the people. And that this cultural order was the order that would ensure that human beings got the things that they needed in order to be that kind of a person economically. That they learned charity, in a word, that they learned virtue. He spoke well of capitalism when others didn't. He didn't think of capitalism as a system of private property markets and private profits, the way many people did. He thought those things were preconditions to an order of intellectual activity. That what was distinguishing about capitalism, which was merely an economic system, not a political system, not a moral system, was cap. It was the head. Capitalism was based on what came out of the head, the innovation, the enterprise that could come out of the head. Bolstered by good law and informed by good habits and good ethics. That's what he saw capitalism as. He trusted human liberty, full well recognized, like all of us should, that the person has fallen. Despite that, he realized that the person could be virtuous. He believed the founding fathers of this country also had the same recognition. And he trusted it. And he trusted it, I think, primarily as a Catholic because God set it up this way. God is the one who gave us liberty. God is the one who sets himself before us so that we can choose him freely. And if God set it up that way, man could too. I think those are his contributions, finally.
I think it's very interesting, thank you, Max, that my own, so I came to Novak through his writings on business. Dr. Bella said this morning about my story in coming as an immigrant from Switzerland to America and having lived the American dream through the high-tech boom and all of that, and then having experienced people who abuse this freedom that you're talking about, and causing for a great loss and a great fall, also for a questioning of my American dream and love for the American system of free markets. He brought me back through our faith, back to understanding what business really is all about and what that entails from a Catholic anthropological perspective. But one thing that we had a long-standing argument about, and I don't recommend anybody argue with Novak because it's not, it's a difficult experience in the sense that, but I think it was providential that Michael and I had this big disagreement, me being European, being from Catholic Europe, in a country like Switzerland where we lost to the Protestants and they became from a Catholic, it became a Protestant country, very much influenced by the French Revolution, and we, the minority Catholic, have a deep and utter suspicion against anything revolutionary, speaking the French Revolution, and we regard the American Revolution exactly as the same thing. I know you're going to react to this, but that's what the experience is of Catholic Europe, which is actually one of the reasons of how the church reacts to what Michael Novak had to say, and to what the American founding has to say, and what the American experiment is. And my long-standing argument with Michael has always been that I have a deep suspicion of the American founding and of the intention of the American founding fathers. Dennis Teddy is here, and he knows me well, and he is part of that whole argument. And the argument was only settled exactly a half a year before Michael passed away. And he said, so now it's time to, he kept giving me things to read, and we had a book club, and we argued about all of this a lot. Eventually he said, look, I'm going to be in Lewis this summer, and I want you and Michelle to come out and visit me, and we're going to settle it once and for all. And so I did go out there, and the beauty is, again, what you say, Jay, is the beauty was that we went out there, and Michelle went to the beach with Eli, and Michael said, okay, now you and I, we're going to have a drink. And now we're going to, and there's this porch in the back, the covered porch in his house, and he says, and we're going to go back there, and you're going to smoke your pipe. And if I were allowed to smoke the pipe, I'd smoke it too. He even had a pipe, but he didn't fill it with tobacco. And we spent several hours in there where he both listened to me and then worked the whole argument through and actually changed my mind and helped me recognize where these suspicions are coming from. I'm telling you this story because I think this is one of the key aspects of what we're doing here at CUA, and the key contributions we're going to make to the world church, to the Catholic Church, to help the church overall understand what this American experience and these ideas of our founding fathers have to contribute to Christianity worldwide and to Catholicism in particular. And us as the Pontifical University, I think this is one of the contributions we make to the larger church, and that I personally, as knowing exactly what the European Catholics think about this, have the privilege to participate in this and maybe help being a spokesperson over to the Vatican is a great privilege, and I think Michael always knew that could be something that he could mold me into becoming an advocate for that. Aurora, tell us about your view of Michael's long legacy intellectually.
I'm happy to. I have to say what you've both been talking about resonates with me on a couple levels. And the first, having a drink out on his porch in Lewis is something I can remember as well, having been invited out there one summer with several people in this room. And then going back through my correspondence with him and seeing him write I wish I had brought as many people to Christ as I had to Manhattans. Well, so from an intellectual perspective, my view is that his greatest contribution is exactly in what we've been touching on here, the three pillars of democracy, capitalism, and culture, specifically the Christian religion, being these pillars of a flourishing, free human society. Michael was this winsome intellectual giant in my mind who, like Thomas Aquinas or Augustine, was marvelously interdisciplinary and held these ideas which seemed to be contradictory, in both hands, making relevant distinctions to help them come together, just in such a rare way. He really was a philosopher of both and. I want to briefly touch on these principles as they were articulated in his essay Karatopolis, A New Global Vision, because from my perspective, that was a mature reflection about the contributions that he made in the spirit of democratic capitalism. He begins, "What would it profit the human race if we were to achieve a higher level of political and economic liberty than ever before, only to live like pigs, enslaved to our desires without reflection or deliberation? This would be a travesty, for it's not only our political and economic systems that must be worthy of our human nature, but also our habits of moral living." So, in this essay, he's saying, what is the best political system? Well, he says, I solved that earlier, it's a democracy. What is the best economic system? Check, capitalism. But what is that third principle? What is that moral ecology? That was something that he was still striving toward and writing about. At the end of his life, he was a very prolific author and still had more stuff in the works. So Karatopolis, incidentally, his students here apparently called him Professor Carrot Top because he talked about this so much. But I think Caritas was, it was the pinnacle of his intellectual and his personal life. He was this rarely integrated person who had them both together. Just to give a couple brief examples of how I think that's true. He once told me that when addressing an audience and giving a speech, the very first thing you have to do is tell the audience that you love them. Now, I think that Michael could probably get up and just tell you that straight away, but I have to find more indirect ways of saying it, but I always do that, and that is in remembrance of him. The second is that in every single one of my correspondences with him, I went back and read them all, either in the title or the sign-off or the content, he communicated to me that he loved me. And just being so creative and being able to do that in any number of ways, it's something that we have to continually do for each other. And he did it so well. And then last, those of you who attended his funeral will know that Ubi Caritas was played twice. By his request, Ubi Caritas et amor Deus ibi est. Where charity and love are, God is there. And where Michael was, there was charity and love.
Michael.
I think it's hard to point to something particular that is his lasting contribution in part for the reasons that Jay Richards was explaining earlier. He's a synthetic and an integrative thinker, but I want to say something else about him. I think that he was realist in the sense that he told us the way things were, but we're not inclined to look at them in that way. And in that regard, I think he's something like a de Tocqueville of our time. So de Tocqueville published his famous book in 1835, and Michael's Spirit of Democratic Capitalism came out in 82, so it's 150 years later. De Tocqueville stood the test of time pretty well. Now his study is not as extensive, but I think it's playing a similar role It's the role of de Tocqueville relative to recent American society. I mean, taking into account the full scope, but maybe especially what was reaching a kind of pinnacle in the so-called greatest generation. And I had a colleague once who said that he thought the task of teaching was simply to point to things and ask others to look at them. And Novak and I did a lot of that in our courses that dealt with culture, music, and art. I actually have a funny story about a professor at Notre Dame who was a famous logician, and he was incapable of explaining anything for that reason because he saw immediately everything. So when he had some kind of complicated proof and some student asked, well, explain this proof, he'd say, well, first you get this, and then you get this, and then you get this, and then you get this, and that's all that he could say because he saw intuitive. So you have to lead people to see something, not just point to them, right? And in this connection, excuse the dive into popular culture, but it's actually high culture now compared with popular culture. But I was thinking of the sound of the Fiddler on the Roof, and there's that famous song, "Do You Love Me?" Right? Tevye asks his wife, right? And she says, well, wait a second, I wash your clothes, I cook your meals, I take care of you when you're sick. It's kind of enumeration concretely. And at the end of the song, they realize, well, she does love him, right? How could he not see this, though, right? And I think Novak's writing is like that. It's lots of good things are taking place in the American experience. Let's enumerate them. Let's be honest about them. Let's count them up. Then let's also ask the realistic question relative to human sin, capacity to sin and propensity to sin, although not a depraved nature. Could we hope for anything better than this? Doesn't this work out pretty well and correspond to the human personality and generally raise everyone? That's the way he looked at things. So then kind of a final point for to say, well, how can we carry this forward? I would say the Catholic University of America is really distinctively poised to do that. If you think about the title of the university, just pause and reflect on that. It wasn't called the Catholic University, it might have been, or the Catholic University of Washington, D.C. The Catholic University of America was deliberately picked because of a twofold mission of the university towards the inheritance and the riches of the Catholic faith and its intellectual tradition, and also the distinctive goods of the American experience in the American Republic, the American experiment. So this is exactly the place where Novak's realism, I think, needs to be captured and passed on to a next generation.
It's beautiful. Of course, one of the things that we shared with him is our love for John Paul II, St. John Paul. When Michael started working with us, we prepared a press release, and I started to just put the outlines together so somebody in marketing could handle this. And when you start to try to say, okay, in a press release you say Novak is such and such, and he received this and this, and we're sitting there both, like he was sitting there in the same office, and I look over to Michael and say, listen, like there's no way we're gonna get all of this into this press release. Like I have to use some judgment here, like 2 or 3, right? Which ones are the most important? And he told me that the most important award he has ever received, and the thing that he is the proudest of and cherished most, is that when he was when John Paul was interviewed and was asked about economics and economic issues, that he identified Michael Novak as being one of the people who taught him a lot on this, and he said, that is Michael Novak, and he is my friend. And he said, that's my most proud achievement, more than any doctorate or honorary doctorate I received. And so I think it's a fitting way to finish this, to end this panel, to say that maybe all of us in here are not just proud that he was our colleague and he ended up teaching here at CUA, but that he was our friend. So with that, we close this panel.